Today I want to share with you an interesting story about a lost journal, lost for 150 years, written by a man who recorded some very interesting events that are now popularly known as Charles Bonnet syndrome. But let me ask you first of all, have you ever had an experience where you're taking out the trash late at night and all of a sudden you hear a sound perhaps and you look in the darkness and you think perhaps there's a bear or a stranger, or your mind just sort of wanders and tries to invent what may or may not be there? Or perhaps you're out camping around a campfire. In the dimness of the light, you hear a crackle, and all of a sudden a bush becomes a bear, or perhaps a tree becomes a deer. Our mind tends to want to make up what it can't actually perceive in total. I want to focus today on the Charles Bonnet syndrome and find out what this mysterious journal has to do with that and what conclusions we can talk about the uniqueness of the brain and its function. Dr. Ramachandran, in his book Phantoms of the Brain, deals with the bizarre effect known as the Charles Bonnet syndrome, otherwise known as CBS. In his book, Dr. Ramachandran deals with areas of the fringe, that is, rare cases of abnormal conditions, anomalies of behavior, and experiences that reveal significant insights into how the brain functions. Charles Bonnet was an 18th century Swiss naturalist whose investigations ranged broadly from entomology to reproduction and regeneration in polyps and other animalcules. He was the first to observe and record parthenogenesis, the production of offspring by an unfertilized female. He himself suffered from an eye disease that made his love of microscopy impossible. He was also known to perform early experiments on photosynthesis. But after his eyes began to fail, he turned to psychology and later philosophy. Charles Bonnet's grandfather, Charles Llewellyn, had at age 77 undergone surgery, removing cataracts from his eyes. 11 years later, Charles Llewellyn began to suffer from vivid hallucinations. People would suddenly appear, then disappear, as would objects that would grow in size, then recede. Faces would become distorted, bizarre transformations would occur. Bonnet began to record these unusual experiences in a journal concerning his grandfather's condition and published it in 1760. The journal was lost for nearly 150 years until rediscovered and identified and translated in an early 20th century work done by Louis Dreyzma titled Disturbances of the Mind. I here submit an account from the lost journal as detailed in Dreyzma's book. In February 1758, strange objects had begun to float into his field of vision. It started with something that resembled a blue handkerchief with small yellow circles in each corner. The handkerchief followed the movement of his eyes. Whether he was looking at a wall, his bed, or a tapestry, the handkerchief blocked out all the ordinary objects in his room. Llewellyn was perfectly lucid, and at no time did he believe that there was really a blue handkerchief floating around. I will pause here and share that one of the distinct attributes of the syndrome is that the illustrations differ from those suffering from, say, schizophrenia, where the delusions, hallucinations are more egocentric in nature, that is, feeling as if they were truly happening, unable to separate the illusion or hallucination from reality. Those experiencing CBS know the illusions are not real, even though they are vivid, lucid, and appear real. The journal continues. One day in August, two granddaughters came to see him. Llewellyn was sitting in his armchair opposite the mantelpiece, and his visitors were to his right. From the left, two young men appeared, and they were wearing magnificent cloaks, red and gray, and their hats were trimmed with silver. "What handsome gentlemen you brought with you! Why didn't you tell me they were coming?" But the young ladies swore that they saw no one. Like the handkerchief, The images of the two men dissolved within a few moments. They were followed by many more imaginary visitors in the next few weeks, all of them women. They were beautifully coiffed and dressed. Several of them had a small box on their head. Somewhat later, Lowen was standing at the window when he saw a carriage approaching. It came to a halt at his neighbor's house, and as he watched in amazement, the carriage grew bigger and bigger until it was level with the eaves of the house, some 30 feet from the ground, with everything perfectly in proportion. Lowen was amazed by the variety of images he saw. One time it was a swarm of specks that suddenly turned into a flight of pigeons. Another time, a group of dancing butterflies. Once he saw a rotating wheel floating in the air, the kind you saw in dockside cranes. On a stroll through the town, he stopped to admire an enormous scaffolding, and when he arrived home, he saw the same scaffolding standing in the living room, but then in miniature, less than a foot high. Dr. Oliver Sacks writes in his book, Hallucinations, Charles Bonnet syndrome was considered rare before 1990. There were only a handful of case histories in medical literature. I thought this strange, for working in an old age homes and nursing homes for over 30 years, I had seen a number of blind or purblind patients with complex visual hallucinations of the Charles Bonnet type, just as I had seen a number of deaf or nearly deaf patients with auditory and most often musical hallucinations. I wondered whether CBS was actually much commoner than the literature seemed to indicate. Recent studies has confirmed that this is the case. Although CBS is still little recognized even by doctors, and there is much to suggest that many or most cases are overlooked or misdiagnosed. Robert Tunis and his colleagues, studying a population of nearly 600 elderly patients with visual problems in Holland, found that almost 15% of them had complex hallucinations of people, animals, scenes, and as many as 80% had simple hallucinations, shapes, colors, sometimes patterns, but not formed images or scenes. Dr. Ramachandran writes in his book on the same subject of CBS, where a woman saw not people and simple objects, but cartoons on some occasions. Disney characters would appear before her eyes. However, unlike others who encounter moving parts and pieces, the cartoon images were not animated, but still. He writes of the advanced work done by Dr. Gerald Edelman of the Neuroscience Institute in La Jolla, California on CBS. Dr. Edelman suggests that the brain's information flow resembles the images in a funhouse full of mirrors, continually changed by the process of reflection. Like separate light beams in a funhouse, visual information can take many different paths, sometimes diverging, sometimes reinforcing itself, sometimes traveling in opposite directions. It is apparent that the brain requires, or rather demands, perceptual input. In its absence or partial inhibition, the lack of central input, in the case of CBS syndrome, visual input, the brain will create its own. Dr. Ramachandran writes some conclusions, again in his book, Phantoms of the Brain. The evidence suggests that what we call perception is really the end result of a dynamic interplay between sensory signals and high-level stored information about visual images from the past. Each time any of us encounters an object, the visual system begins a constant questioning process. Is it an animal? Is it a friend? Is it a foe? What color? What size? What shape? Endless questions the brain asks. The higher visual centers then project partial, best fit answers back to lower visual areas, including the primary visual cortex. In this manner, the impoverished image is progressively worked on and refined. with bits filled in when appropriate. He finishes with this statement: but if, as happens in Charles Bonnet syndrome, the brain does not receive confirming visual stimuli, it is free to make up its own reality. And lastly, he quotes James Thurber. He writes these words: there is apparently no limit to its creativity.